You know, when you think of a great story, chances are you're thinking of a novel, right? It's just the way we tell stories now. But have you ever stopped and wondered what was there before the novel? And how on earth did this one type of story come to completely take over the world?
Well, that's what we're going to dig into. Here's our game plan. First up, we're going to look at why a new kind of story was even needed in the first place. Then, we'll get into the secret recipe that cooked it up in the 18th century. After that, we'll dive into the Victorian era, when things just exploded. We'll also meet some of the heavy hitters, the voices that defined an age, and finally, we'll talk about why the novel still has such a grip on us today.
So, let's rewind the clock. Before the 18th century, if you picked up a popular, respected story, well, it probably wouldn't be about anyone you'd recognize. The main characters and the people reading about them were from a completely different world.
For literally centuries, literature was all about the big stuff. You had these epic poems and grand tragedies. They were all about gods, kings, and legendary heroes. You know, people you'd never just meet down at the market. But then things started to shift. Society was changing. A brand new middle class was on the rise. And they were getting more powerful, more educated, and honestly, they were hungry for stories that weren't about gods, but about them. Their daily lives, their struggles, their dreams of climbing that social ladder.
And that's where the novel comes in. It was basically invented to fill that exact void. I mean, the name itself comes from the Italian word novella, which just means a little new thing, and it really truly was new. We're talking about a long story written in everyday prose, not some fancy poetry. It was all about characters you could actually believe in, caught up in complex situations that felt totally real, even if the story itself was made up.
Now, something like the novel doesn't just happen. It wasn't an accident. It was more like a perfect storm. You had all these different ingredients swirling around in the 18th century, creating the absolute perfect conditions for this new art form to be born. Okay, so what were these ingredients? Well, for one, traditional plays, which had been the main way people got their stories, were kind of fading in popularity. At the same time, you had these things called periodical essays popping up. You could think of them like the hot blogs of the 1700s. They were filled with witty, smart takes on social life and regular people, so folks were getting used to reading about everyday stuff. On top of all that, there was this growing idea that, hey, the lives of common people actually matter. People wanted stories that felt real. The stage was perfectly set.
And leading the charge were four trailblazing authors. We're talking about Richardson, Smollett, Fielding, and Sterne. These guys were so important, so crucial to getting this whole thing off the ground that they're now known as the four wheels of the novel. They literally carried the entire genre forward.
So, if the 18th century mixed the ingredients and lit the fuse, then the 19th century, the Victorian era, was the massive explosion. This is when the novel went from being this interesting new thing to an absolute world-changing cultural force.
Now, when I say explosion, I mean it. The numbers are just mind-boggling. Think about this. At the start of the Victorian era, maybe 100 new novels came out each year. By the end of it, that number jumped to 1,000, a full tenfold increase. That is just incredible growth. So what was going on? What caused this massive boom? Well, it was another perfect storm, really. You had the Industrial Revolution, which brought in new printing technology that made books way, way cheaper. More people were learning to read than ever before. And then came the real game changer, serialization. Authors started publishing their novels one chapter at a time in cheap newspapers. It was like the 19th century version of a weekly TV show drop. People were totally hooked. And all this new popularity created a huge stage for some of the most famous authors in history. These were writers who grabbed this new art form and used it like a mirror to reflect the crazy, fast-paced, changing world all around them. I mean, you had guys like Charles Dickens who became the equivalent of modern-day rock stars. His stories weren't about kings, they were about poor orphan boys and struggling factory workers. He built entire worlds filled with characters that this huge new middle-class readership could really connect with. When a new Dickens chapter came out, it was the event. You had to read it. But there's another side to this story, a kind of hidden history. Because while the novel was exploding, a lot of its most powerful and groundbreaking voices had to stay in the shadows. Why? Because they were women. And in that era, a woman writing a novel was just not seen as a serious thing. So to get their work published and taken seriously, they had to hide behind fake male names. You've heard of Currer Bell, who wrote Jane Eyre? That was actually Charlotte Bronte. Ellis Bell, who gave us the unforgettable Wuthering Heights? That was her sister, Emily. And one of the most celebrated novelists of the age, George Eliot?
was really a woman named Mary Ann Evans. And these women weren't just writing polite little stories. Oh no, they were tackling huge, controversial issues. Take the youngest Bronte sister, Anne. She wrote a book called The Tenant of Wildfeld Hall about a woman who packs her bags and leaves her abusive husband. Today, that sounds like a brave step, but back then, it was completely scandalous, an absolutely radical idea. That book is now considered one of the very first feminist novels ever. So let's pull all of this together. The rise of the novel. It wasn't just about a new trend in books. It was a flat-out revolution. It was a revolution in who gets to tell the story, and maybe even more importantly, whose story is worth telling.
The great writer Henry James put it perfectly. He said, "The only reason a novel should exist is to try and represent life." And that's the key right there. Not the life of some mythical king, but real life. The messy, complicated, wonderful lives of regular people like you and me. The novel basically democratized storytelling.
And that powerful, revolutionary idea that your life, my life, is worthy of a great story, that is the novel's real, enduring legacy. It's a legacy we see all around us, in the books we love, the TV shows we binge watch, and the movies that move us. So that leaves us with one last question to chew on. If the novel was born to be a mirror for its time, what do our stories, right now, say about us?